This week, T takes on padded rolling benches with storage. I get started by breaking down the plywood. I use 2 sheets of 3/4 inch and 1 sheet of 1/2 inch maple plywood to build the carcasses. Using my circular saw and track, I cut each sheet in half to make it more manageable to handle at the table saw. Notice that I use insulation foam under the sheets for a solid and expendable support. I make my first cuts at the table saw oversized. I then adjust my fence to final dimension to cut off the factory edges off the plywood. This way, I have a cleaner cut and I don't have to worry about chipped edges. At the miter saw, I cut the top and bottom pieces to 42 inches in length. Unfortunately, my miter saw can't cut through the 18-inch pieces in one pass. I make my cuts about halfway through, flip the piece over, and finish off the cut. I adjust my stop block to 14 inches to cut the vertical supports and dividers. I also cut out 2 13-inch spacer blocks on some scrap 1/2 inch plywood that I will use later for assembly. Here's a quick tip. Use a heat gun and a putty knife to remove stickers. Simply heat the sticker to soften the adhesive, use the putty knife to lift the edge, and peel off. I use pocket holes for my joinery. I mark drill holes 2 inches from each end, 1 in the center, and 2 more in between, totaling 5 holes per edge. In retrospect, 10 holes per piece is a bit overkill since I'm also using glue. If you were to do this yourself, I would recommend using only 3 screws per edge along with some glue. I don't realize it yet, but I will soon regret using 80 pocket holes in the build. With everything cut, it's time to assemble the benches. I start off by laying the top piece on its side. Using clamps, I glue up the 18-inch edge of an end piece and screw it into place. I use the 13-inch spacers I cut earlier between each vertical divider. Once I have all vertical pieces in place, I flip the bench, glue the edges, drive in the screws, and repeat the process for the second bench. I use 4/4 rough cut pine that I have in stock for the face frame. I use an 8-foot plywood board as a planer sled. I secure each pine board to the sled using painter's tape, shims, and hot glue. I check my height, adjust my planer settings, and send each board through until I have a flat reference surface. Once all 3 boards are flat on one face, I put the sled away, scrape off any hot glue, flip the boards over, and start planing down to a 3/4 inch thickness. With the faces nice and flat, I push the planer away and head over to the jointer. Here, I straighten one edge on each board that I can use as a reference against the table saw. I set my table saw fence to 1.5 inches and rip down 2 of my boards. I save the shortest board for last as I'll cut it to a different width later. At the miter saw, I cut each piece to an oversized length, leaving some room for mitered corners. I make sure that I have 8 44-inch long pieces that will be placed horizontally, 8 20-inch horizontal end pieces, and 16 14-inch pieces that will make up the vertical corners of each bench. Back at the table saw, I adjust my fence to 3/4 of an inch and rip down my last board. I do cut some extra pieces just because there are some knots in the middle of the board. I go back to the miter saw and cut these to length at 14 inches. I make sure I have at least 8 in total for the vertical dividers. I go back to the table saw for the last time of the day to cut the miters for the vertical corners. Here, I make sure to keep the nicer faces upward and cut off the blemishes. It's a pretty thin cut, so I make good use of the gripper. Not sponsored, yet. At the miter saw, I cut the miters starting at one end. Off camera, I take the piece over to the bench for a test fit, mark the other end, and sneak up on the cuts to 43.5 inches. I place 3/4 inch plywood scraps underneath the bench as a spacer so that the frame is flush against the bottom shelf. I glue up the edges of the bench and secure each piece with my 18 gauge brad nailer. For the ends, I once again sneak up on the cuts at 19.5 inches for a perfect fit. With the bottom attached, I can rest the vertical pieces on top and secure them to the dividers with glue and brad nails. Once all the verticals are in place, I can fasten the rest of the face frame on the first bench and begin the process for the second bench. Everything is fine until my mitered corners don't line up. I wasn't paying attention and my end piece was slightly creeping up, leaving a significant gap at the corner. I finished attaching the long side, making sure it's still flush with the bottom shelf, flip the bench over, and like anything else in life, fix it by hitting it with a hammer, or in this case, a rubber mallet. I cut off the brad nails with my Dremel, reglue the edge, reshoot the piece back into place, finish off the rest of the face frame, and call it a night. I begin day 3 by filling the pocket holes with glue and plugs. After the glue dries, I use my flush cut saw to trim the excess. It's at this point that I regret making 80 pocket holes in the build. If I used 6 holes per vertical panel, I would only have to cut 48 plugs. Anyway, after trimming all the plugs, I sand down each one with 180 grit sandpaper and use wood filler to fill in my brad nail holes, pocket hole plugs, and any other voids on the visible surface. After the wood filler dries, I go back to my sander with 180 grit and clean up every spot. I sand thoroughly to remove any orange colored stain left behind from the wood filler. I didn't think much of it before, but sanding is now officially my least favorite part of woodworking. These benches are made specifically for little children. I need every single edge to be soft to the touch. I take my router and ease all edges with a 1/4 inch round over bit. One of the edges slid on me just as I finished my last pass with the router. Although devastated, I embraced the mistake and sanded down smooth with 220. I continue sanding the rest of both benches with 220 to prepare them for finish. Before finishing for the day, I install caster wheels to the bottom of the benches. I use my brad nailer to fasten 3/4 inch plywood offcuts in each corner. These spacer blocks grant access to the brakes instead of being hidden underneath the face frame. I shoot 1.25 inch brads in a T pattern to avoid interference with the wheel screws in the corners. I go grab the wheels and place them on the benches when this happens. The fallen wheels damage the face frame. I once again embrace my mistake and sand down the dents. Lesson learned, place your hardware on the ground to avoid dumb accidents. I pre-drill each corner with a 1/4 inch drill bit to prevent any tear out. I secure the included 1.25 inch long screws with my impact driver. And with that, I am done with the structural portion of this bench build. Day 4 is making all the storage boxes. Once again, I break down a sheet of 1/2 inch maple plywood with my track and circular saw. At the table saw, I rip down pieces to 7 inches in width. Just as I'm about to make my second cut, I notice that my fence is not secured in the back. I take my speed square, set my fence back to 90 degrees, and lock my fence into place. If you are in the market for a table saw, I recommend a saw with a rack and pinion style fence or some other fence with a single front locking mechanism. Anyway, I continue ripping down boards until I have 8 total pieces at 7 inches wide. I then adjust my fence to 11.5 inches and cut the remainder of my stock. At the miter saw, I take my 7 inch wide pieces and cut them to 17 inches in length. I then adjust my stop block to 12.5 inches to cut the rest of my pieces. In total, I have 12 7x17s for the sides, 12 7x12.5 for the front and backs, and 6 11.5x17s for the bottoms. Using offcuts, I make a template jig to cut the holes for the handles on the front and back pieces. After marking the desired location, I use an 1.25 inch Forstner bit to drill my ends, draw parallel lines connecting the two, and cut out the middle with my jigsaw. I can then insert my piece into the jig, drill a 3/8 hole, insert my router with a flush trim bit, and follow the template below. I then can repeat this process 11 more times. This jig will prove to be quite useful throughout the rest of the day. Still using my jig, I insert each piece and use my router with a 1/4 inch roundover bit to ease both sides of the handles. As I stated earlier, everything to this build must not have any sharp corners or edges. Next, I use my roundover bit to get the top edges of all 4 sides of the storage boxes. Doing the top edges now is easier because the router has more surface area on the faces to reference. I will later round over the rest of the other corners once the storage boxes are assembled. This will all make sense later in the video. Anyway, I keep pressing on rounding over my edges when I think to myself, this would be much easier and faster if I had a router table. Oh well, onto the assembly. I assembled the boxes with the help of my jig for the last time. I aligned 3 sides with the jig with painter's tape to avoid gluing the boxes to it. This jig works perfectly to align and hold up 3 sides to the bottom of each box. I glue 3 edges of the bottom piece, push it into the front, glue and attach the sides, and secure everything in place with 3/4 inch brad nails. I make sure to shoot brads connecting the front face to the sides and shoot each face into the bottom piece. It takes me a couple of boxes to get my groove, but I eventually find my rhythm. Here, the glue on the tape was starting to solidify. I simply peel it off and replace it. With a fresh tape on the jig, I'm good to go and finish assembling the rest of the boxes. This marks the end of day 4. I begin day 5 by working on the storage boxes. I take my wood filler and cover up all the nail holes on each face. I let the filler dry and knock it down with 180 grit sandpaper. Once again, I use my router with a roundover bit to get the rest of the corners. Now that the boxes are fully assembled, I have a better reference area for the router to lay flat against. When I'm done easing all the corners, I sand both the inside and the outside of the boxes with 220. To get the inside of the handles, I wrap a 1-inch dowel with sandpaper and go to town. Like the router table, I need to get myself a spindle sander. With everything sanded down to 220, I'm ready to apply my finish. I decided to use shellac for my finish. This is actually my first time using shellac, but from my research, I believe it will be the fastest and easiest finish to apply, while at the same time giving the benches and storage boxes durable protection. Using a foam brush, I apply a thin layer of undiluted shellac to all visible faces on the benches and boxes. After applying, I let it dry for 20 minutes. While the shellac is drying, I take my benchtop pieces to the table saw and trim 1/8 of an inch off the width. This will allow space for the vinyl top, foam, and wood to fit nicely into the bench's top recess. Now that the shellac is dry, I go back to my sander and lightly sand everything down with 220 to prepare for final finish. Off camera, I make sure to also sand down the handles on the storage boxes. Once I am done sanding, I wipe everything down with a tack cloth. For the last coat, I dilute the shellac with denatured alcohol. This thins the shellac significantly, allowing for a nice thin coat that spreads easily. Exhausted, I apply the last coat to the rest of the pieces and call it a night. I start the 6th and final day by working on the storage boxes first. I sand the inside and outside with 320 and make sure to get the handles by hand. Next, I follow up with a gray 3M between coats finishing pad and a white 3M finishing pad. These pads are equivalent to fine grades of steel wool and are perfect to remove any raised bubbles or dust nibs in the final coat. Best of all, they don't splinter or shred like steel wool. I repeat this process on the 2 benches. With everything done and smooth to the touch, I apply a coat of paste wax and let it dry. On to the padded bench tops. I want to preface this by saying that this is my first time doing any upholstery. At this time, I also want to give a huge shout out to my father-in-law and professional upholsterer, Tom, for giving me a super quick crash course on how to do this step. I get started by placing my 1/2-inch maple bench top on top of my 3-inch foam. I then draw my lines about a 1/4 inch oversized. I make sure to draw my lines on both the top and bottom sides of the foam to ensure that I make my cuts perfectly vertical. Using an old bread knife, I cut the short side of the foam just fine. However, I can't say the same about the long side. After finishing the cut, I notice that I'm way outside my line and the edges are completely wavy and jagged. I try to fix it, but the foam is just too soft to trim down effectively with my bread knife. I highly recommend cutting foam on a bandsaw to guarantee straight lines. Since I don't own a bandsaw, I use the next best thing, my jigsaw. The problem is that my blade only cuts 1.5 inches deep, so I have to flip the foam over. With the jigsaw, I am able to correct my mistake and even use it for cleaner cuts on the second bench top. Before attaching the foam to the bench tops, I take my jigsaw to cut a 1 inch by 1/8 inch notch in all 4 corners on both pieces. This allows space to fold the vinyl and not be too snug in the corners when I insert the bench top into the recess. Before I make my cuts, I cover each corner with painter's tape to prevent any tear out. I spray adhesive and carefully place the foam on the bench top, making sure I have an 1/8 inch overhang on every side. I lay down the vinyl and get started by fastening one staple in the center of the short side. I then pull the material tight on the opposite side and secure another staple in the center. I flip the bench over to check how it looks and continue on. I pull the vinyl towards the center, keeping pressure and making sure it is nice and taut. I am also constantly feeling the corner below, smoothing out the vinyl and making sure I don't have any wrinkles forming. Once I am done with the short sides, I repeat the process for the long sides. For the corners, I make sure that the short sides are stapled pretty close to the end. I use chalk to mark my 1-inch notch and the vertical fold from the long side. From the vertical line, I measure 1 inch away towards the material corner and draw another vertical line. I then draw a line connecting the second vertical line to the line notch. From here, I can cut off the excess and free up some space in the corners and staple the rest. I finish up the rest of the corners and repeat this process for the second bench top. I go back to the boxes and benches with a soft rag and buff out the paste wax applied earlier. I insert the padded bench tops into place and clean the surfaces. I can officially call this project complete. These benches aren't staying here at the house, they are actually here in my wife's classroom where they will be used as her mobile library. Thank you for tuning in to T Takes On, and I'll catch you in the next one.